From the Great Depression to the Great Recession by Margaret Du Bois. Throughout my childhood, President Herbert Hoover presided over our dining room. No, not in person, but he definitely was a presence. In 1928, my grandfather, Reverend Frank Du Bois, had mounted the black-framed photo of Hoover above the telephone on the wall in celebration of Hoover's landslide presidential election victory over Governor Al Smith of New York. Hoover's coattails may well have accounted for Grandpa's own election to the Missouri State Legislature that same year. So, the photo was there in 1929, when my mother, brother, and I left my father to continue his job hunting in St. Louis and arrived to live at Grandpa's farm near Cabool, Missouri. It was still there in 1943 when I left for war work in California at the age of 19. At my grandparents' dinner table, politics was served with our daily bread. Grandpa, having spent a lifetime delivering sermons and speeches, used the dining table as his personal bully pulpit. He read the newspaper and the Congressional Record aloud, with interjections and robust commentary. At his dinner table, children were to be seen and not heard. My brother and I soon learned that sometimes we must wait a long time for a break in the bombast before we could say, "Please pass the butter." Grandma did not share in the discussions. Years earlier, after a serious illness, she had lost her hearing. Except for when someone, after our arrival, this was almost always my mother, wrote out for her what was going on, she lived in a silent world of her own musings. Since I was only 5 when we moved to the farm after the crash of 1929, I understood then little of that political talk that washed over me. I did learn, however, that the man in the photo over the telephone must be greatly admired. "Hoover's a gentleman," Grandpa would say, "a true Christian gentleman. Besides that, he's practical. He did a great job feeding the hungry in Europe during that World War President Woodrow Wilson got us into. Hoover holds fast to his principles, and he knows the financial system will turn itself around if we only keep the government out of it." As I grew older, I began dimly to grasp that people in the world beyond our dining table were having a great deal of trouble, and a lot of them were really mad at the man in the picture frame. Mama said a lot of them were like my daddy, looking for steady work and not finding it, and blaming Mr. Hoover. In the newspaper Grandpa read to us, Mr. Hoover said, "Prosperity is just around the corner." And Grandpa said that was right, but people with no jobs might not believe Mr. Hoover. In the fall of 1930, Grandpa was campaigning for re-election to the legislature. He drove off in his Model T to make speeches around Texas County, but mostly he depended on mailings. Child labor is useful for mailings. I recall several long afternoons my brother and I spent licking stamps. I was shocked when Grandpa lost. Grandpa took it in stride. "What's to be said?" he said. "Texas County usually votes Democrat. Right now, with newspaper stories every day about the millions of jobless, it's easy to blame Republicans. Just wait. When prosperity comes back, as it soon will, voters may change again." The summer I turned 7, 1931, Daddy came from St. Louis to live with us on Grandpa's farm. I went joyfully back to being Daddy's girl. But the Daddy who came back from 2 years of unstable work and job hunting in St. Louis was not the same playful, joking Daddy I remembered. True, around the dining table he told stories and laughed and sometimes argued with Grandpa, but nearly every evening of that first summer After the milking was done and supper eaten, he would ask me to go with him on some last errand to the barn. Then always, always, as the twilight closed in and the stars and the lightning bugs came out, we ended up leaning on the fence to the cow lot, and Daddy started to talk to me in a low, hurting voice, telling me he was a worthless failure and we would all be better off if he were dead. I felt sad and frightened and almost unable to speak. I told him we wouldn't be better, that he mustn't be dead. But he didn't seem to hear me or believe me. He just went on saying it. I liked being chosen as Daddy's confidant, but I was scared because I didn't know how to make him stop feeling so bad and saying those dreadful things. Somehow, I didn't think I should tell anybody, or Mama, and I never did. After a while, school started again, the days got shorter, and the talk stopped and never restarted. That winter, my brother and I both had diphtheria, and Daddy was a mainstay in caring for us. In an odd way, that serious illness may have helped Daddy turn a corner. It may have clarified life and death in his mind, so he could resign himself to living as a dependent in his parents' household. The next year, 1932, President Hoover was up for re-election. The talk around our dining table became more heated and excited. I began to understand the terms bread lines, run on the bank, and Hoovervilles. Grandpa, when he wasn't interrupted while holding forth, loved to explain things. Grandpa put his faith in Hoover. He's a sensible man, he said, not like that showman Roosevelt, with all his wild-eyed schemes and promises. Blaming Hoover for what's happened to the country. Hoover didn't cause the crash, but he knows the system will right itself if we just hold on and don't get in the way. Roosevelt won't stand aside, he'll tinker, and if he's elected, this country will never recover. Roosevelt won by what the newspapers called a landslide. That showman Roosevelt couldn't take office until the inaugural, which in 1933 was still in March. During the long interim between November and March, the headlines in the newspaper became more and more scary. I was in the 3rd grade, and the puzzle pieces of how to read had just fallen into place in my brain, so I'd taken off happily and effortlessly into the world of adult reading. Even if Grandpa didn't read the newspaper aloud, I could read the headlines about bank failures. I knew that people could lose all the money they'd saved. I didn't worry that it would happen to us because we had no money to lose. When Inauguration Day finally arrived, the newspaper was full of pictures of enormous crowds in Washington, D.C., cheering and marching. "Oh, they think he's the same savior sent from heaven," Grandpa said dourly. "They'll soon see." A few days later, Roosevelt declared a bank holiday, a time when every bank in the nation closed its doors, not to reopen until a bank examiner had declared it sound. Thousands of banks did not pass muster and were not allowed to reopen. Among them was the bank at Mountain Grove, Missouri, a small town only a few miles from Kabul. Grandpa brought the news from town. The Kabul bank had reopened. The Mountain Grove bank had failed.